All right, and so for this evening, we will be looking at communicative interaction and communicative competence. So we spoke about what it is that we know when we know a language. And we said that we have linguistic competence. So we know the structure of the language, the syntax, the grammar, the phonology, etc. But that's not enough to say that we know a language. We also need to have communicative competence, which looks at the knowledge of how to use the language appropriately. And so we're going to be looking at these two concepts this evening. All right, so you should be able to understand and discuss communication and its components, and distinguish between linguistic competence and communicative competence. Then we'll be looking at speech acts, events, and situations. And of course, we'll be looking at Del Hines. And I mentioned that on Sunday, he is the founding father, so to speak, of sociolinguistics. Right, so we're just going to go through this quickly. It says that communication is simply the process of effectively sending and receiving messages. It's a process of people interacting through the use of messages. So there is some kind of exchange taking place. And we know, of course, that it's not just an exchange of messages, but we know that we use communication to build relationships and even to break them, right? So communication involves content, so that's the substance of the message, and relationship, so it tells us about the sender and the receiver and how they perceive their interaction and how they perceive each other. All right, so you will learn a little bit about face work, and face work has to do with politeness. And when people use what we call face threatening acts, they are being disrespectful, and it says something about how they feel about the receiver or the other participant in the conversation. And it says that effective communication is not just about you sending a message, but also about the recipient or the receiver understanding and interpreting correctly. And so culture is very important in interpreting messages. So we have what we call norms of interaction and norms of interpretation. And these norms are developed within a culture. And so if you don't share the same culture with the interlocutor within the conversation, then you will have miscommunication taking place, right? So let us look a little further. And of course, we know we have verbal and non-verbal communication. And we have some non-verbal communication gestures that are unique to the Caribbean. And we would even say unique to Black people. All right. And you see some of them listed there. And for many individuals, I think when Nollywood, as they call it, the African movies came on the scene, many individuals, they were able to look at these videos, and realize that, wow, we have so many similarities as Black people, and nonverbal communication is one of them. So they push it out of the lips to point or to signal disapproval, gestures, stares, cutting of the eyes, as we call it, snapping of the fingers, hissing of the teeth, or the sucking of the teeth, the akimbo, and so on and so forth. These are culturally defined. And the verbal communication involves the use of words. And of course, some of these can be culturally defined as well, right? So when we discussed, the slang being used by young people, like calling people auntie and uncle, or Jenna, mommy, elder, etc., right? Some of these things are also culturally defined. And of course, we have the sender who will encode the message, the receiver who will receive or decode the message. There's a message itself and the means of conveying the message. So we move on now to discuss linguistic competence. Right, and so with linguistic competence, as I said before, this is the knowledge of the structure of language. So we're looking at the syntax, the phonology, the morphology, etc. So knowing the structure and the components of your language or another language, right? A second language, for instance. So it says linguistic theory treats competence in terms of the child's acquisition of the ability to produce, understand, and discriminate any and all of the grammatical sentences of a language. All right, so you develop competence in a language over time and with practice. And you can hear something and know whether or not that is acceptable in your language, whatever your first language is. Now we move from linguistic competence to talk about communicative competence. Now, the child will not only learn the grammar, but they also need to acquire how it is that they should use language and how it is that they should be speaking with different individuals. So they begin to learn how they can speak to their siblings, might be different from how they can speak to their parents. And so over time, we develop communicative competence, not just knowledge of the structure of the language, but also how to use the language. And so Chomsky says that a fluent native speaker's knowledge of grammar, of whether or not putative sentences are part of his language, and according to what structural relationships. So here he's talking about linguistic competence. So for a while in linguistics, all we spoke about was linguistic competence. Then performance should allow for aspects of linguistic ability which are not grammatical. For example, psychological constraints on memory, choice of alternative rules, and stylistic choices, which might change the phonology or the sound of a word based on individual pronunciations. Now, after exploring linguistic competence, the linguists said, well, we can't just talk about linguistic competence. We have to also include communicative competence, because it makes no sense you know the structure of a language and you don't know how to use the language appropriately. So communicative competence is also important. And this is the knowledge of the appropriateness of language use. So it is a speaker's underlying knowledge of the linguistic system and the norms for the appropriate use of language in particular speech situations. So when we look at language variation, we'll be looking at how individual speakers vary their language according to the context. And the context or the speech situation will include the participants, the occasion, the setting, the type of day, the mood, etc. So Gompertz says, whereas linguistic competence covers the speaker's ability to produce grammatically correct sentences, communicative competence describes his or her ability to select from the totality of grammatically correct expressions available to him, forms which appropriately reflect the social norms governing behavior in specific encounters. So we're looking back at the norms, right? Norms of interpretation and norms of interaction. So having done French or Spanish in high school, it doesn't necessarily mean that now you have communicative competence in that language. All right, let me know if you guys are following.
Following.
All right, great. So for Himes, he decided to look at 4 aspects of competence. So think about it. Linguistic competence has been reigning in the field of linguistics. And so here they're coming with this communicative competence now. So of course, Del Himes, he decided to put forward some aspects of competence to basically make his point that it is as important as linguistic competence. All right. So systemic potential, whether and to what extent something is not yet realized and in a sense not known. Level of appropriateness, whether and to what extent something is in some context suitable or effective. So going into an office using English or using Jamaican Creole, right? Which one do we think is appropriate based on social norms?
English.
English, right. Thank you. So usually we go in and we use English within, let's say, a public agency. But let's say, the individual, they're not getting the service requested and they start to get a little upset. What begins to happen to their speech in terms of language use?
Instead of speaking the standard English that would be required or appropriate for the situation, they speak the language that they're used to. They speak the first language. So people would end up speaking Creole, Patois in that situation.
Right. And I don't know if you've encountered that type of situation where an individual gets upset in a government office, for instance, and they begin to just cuss, right? They go from using English usually to using Jamaican, all right? And that's one of the reasons that individuals cannot imagine a formal genre for Jamaican Creole because we're just so accustomed to seeing Jamaican being used when people are upset. All right. Another one is occurrence, whether and to what extent something is done, and feasibility, whether and to what extent something is possible. So is a particular sentence possible within a particular structure based on the language, going back to norms of interpretation and norms of interaction. And then they go on, Cannell and Swain, go on to define communicative competence. It is a synthesis of knowledge of basic grammatical principles, knowledge of how language is used in social settings to perform communicative functions. So remember we spoke about functions before, social functions, and knowledge of how utterances and communicative functions can be combined according to the principles of discourse. So we are using language to perform functions. And when we look at the speech act theory, it says that all utterances are speech acts. They are used to achieve a particular purpose within an interaction. So for instance, we're in a classroom, physical classroom space, and somebody says, "Oh my, miss, it's so hot." What do you think the student is trying to communicate to the teacher? By declaring that it's hot. Idea?
It could be two things. They could actually just be telling you that the place is hot, or they could be basically asking you to turn on the fan or open a window or something, or even to move the class outside where it's cooler.
Or the AC or whatever it is. Thank you, Janice. So more than likely, they're not just declaring that it's hot, because everybody else can feel that it's hot. So it's actually being done to achieve a particular purpose. So it's serving a function, and it really serves as a request. So there are times when form and function will not match. So it might be a declaration or an assertion, but it really serves the function, that is the communicative function of a request. All right? So it's simply declaring that it's hot. It's not just an assertion, but really a request. So in that case, it's serving a communicative function. And it's up to the recipient in that interaction to be able to interpret correctly. So if it is a request, then the appropriate interpretation would be to turn on the fan or open the door, etc. Right? An inappropriate interpretation would be to say something like, "Yes, it is," or "Okay," without doing something. Right? So that individual would not have realized that a request is being made. So we have grammatical competence. This covers the mastery of phonological rules, lexical items, morphosyntactic rules, and rules of sentence formation. And then we have discourse competence. This refers to the knowledge of rules regarding the cohesion and coherence of various types of discourse. And when we talk about discourse, we're talking about any extended stretch of speech pertaining to a particular activity. All right, so we have what we call discourse genres. For instance, preaching, teaching, being engaged in a debate or a negotiation, giving a speech. These are things that we do every day, and they are governed by specific rules. So discourse competence means that you have knowledge of those rules that would allow you to take part in particular discourse genres. And then we have strategic competence. And this involves the mastery of verbal and non-verbal strategies to compensate for breakdowns and to enhance the effectiveness of communication, right? So being very strategic in how we communicate. Now, some individuals, they don't have strategic competence because the conversation might be breaking down and they say something that contributes further to the breakdown of that interaction. All right. And if you observe interactions in your day-to-day outings and so on, you know, like let's say you're on the bus, you're in a taxi, you're in the market, you're in a store, a conversation can break down easily, can go from 0 to 100 within a second. So we find that people lack strategic competence unless they're really trained, right? So unless they study language, you know, they study communication, etc., they don't really know how to use certain verbal and non-verbal strategies to compensate for the breakdown. And then there is sociolinguistic competence. So this refers to the mastery of sociocultural conventions within varying social contexts. So this type of competence involves rules that are sensitive to various factors. And of course, some of these would be social status, sex, age, etc. Having sociolinguistic competence. So I don't know, I'm not remembering who shared it on Sunday about the miscommunication with the teacher and the student when the student referred to the teacher as auntie. Was that the example? Was it auntie?
Yes, miss, that was it. An uncle for the male coordinator.
Okay, right. Thank you, Vanessa. Right. And so the teacher felt offended or thought that it was disrespectful because she did not have the socio-linguistic competence as it relates to that type of lingo. And so we can see where a lack of this competence can also lead to the breakdown of communication. So if someone didn't step in who had that knowledge, then perhaps the child, you know, would have been punished, or the teenager, you know, would have been punished for being disrespectful, etc. Another sociolinguistic competence that we discussed on Sunday, even though we didn't call it that at the time, is just having a knowledge that within our society, men are expected to use the more informal code, whereas females are expected to use the more formal code. And that is a sociolinguistic universal as well. So within Jamaica, Jamaican Creole has covert prestige among men. So the man them have to talk a certain way. You see what I say? Yeah, Jenna, and so on and so forth. So they have to have this masculinity, which is expressed using Jamaican Creole. Right, men? So at the time,
Yeah, man, I really think that
Yeah, man, I say things that, man. Yeah.
All
Yeah.
right.
yeah.
Just they say
Calvin.
things, no.
So you hear, is it Kivon?
It's Kaiwan.
Oh, Kivon. So Kivon, when he was asking about the recording, etc., you hear Kivon did so. Kivon not talk like that amongst his friends, you know, amongst his dear friends.
Nope.
Definitely not. So that is an example of sociolinguistic competence, knowing what is expected within particular domains as it relates to gender. All right. And also, we know that there are social consequences if we breach some of these things. All right, the components now of competence in terms of the linguistic knowledge, the verbal elements, so the lexical items or the words and their meanings and the different forms. So the girl, the gal, the babes, the goodas, the goodie, lady, dolly, etc., etc. Right? So again, talking about culture. And then the non-verbal elements, the patterning of the elements, so how we combine them in sequence, and the range of possible variants. So for example, greetings. So how do we greet each other in Jamaica usually? What are some of the ways? So I'll do the first one, Wagwan.
They'll ask you sometime, you're good?
I think this one, why pre?
All right, so let me just go back. So you're good. Yes, that's one of them. And what's the next one? Did you say why pre?
Yes, miss. Yeah, yes, miss. Why pre?
Oh, well, I learned something that is used as a greeting.
Yes, it's like asking you what's up, but as
Yes, used
well,
for various stuff. It's
as,
used in that context too.
Right.
It's just the tone that let you know what it's being used for.
Okay.
Right.
So it's kind of like it has evolved into a greeting.
Yes, miss.
Right.
Okay, because I think it came from a song, no, so? Something about
Yes,
why
miss.
pre. Right, and then we see how it has now transitioned into a greeting. Very interesting. Anything else?
Maybe yo, depending on if you're approaching somebody with non-verbal cues like yo.
Mm-hmm.
So the tone and the non-verbal accompanied with the yo, and how you know how you say the yo. So yo can be a response like yo. Like
anybody
yes,
familiar with Yush?
Yes, miss.
Yes, miss.
Okay.
Yes,
Yeah, viewers. Yeah, viewers.
Yeah,
white chopping. Not really, no, miss. That's outdated.
Okay, because that's why I'm surprised that you guys know it, because I'm like, Yusha from some long time.
Calvin, man, I read my beer, man,
Yeah. Miss the most use white prayer, wagwan cause, wagwan farm, or white choppings.
Yeah, cause.
Yeah, wagwan cause boy. Or white choppings, or white joggings.
White choppings. Oh, geez, so much.
Yeah, white choppings.
Okay, and that is a greeting. Wow. So we have a range of greetings.
It's definitely a greeting.
Yes, and if you're not from that particular speech community, you don't know what they mean. Okay, I wonder what's up. Right? So if people aren't familiar, if they don't have that competence, again, the socio-linguistic competence, they're gonna be lost. So right now we have Jamaicans who can be speaking to each other and them not understanding each other based on these new developments. Any other greetings? And another thing regarding greetings, for instance, if the individual say, where you depend, or wagwan, or wam, or how you do, or how are you doing? No, note that it's a question. It's in the form of a question. Now, what would be the norm of interpretation for that question? Wagwan. What is the norm for that?
So what is the answer for Wagwan? Nothing. You said nothing.
I think it's me there. There, man. Yeah.
Right. So the norm of interpretation and interaction. So you interpret it to be a greeting. So the norm of interaction would be to return that greeting. You can return it by saying the same thing. Wagwan, wagwan, where you depend, or you answer nothing or medea, etc. However, if the individual, the recipient, does not share the same socio-linguistic competence, then they can interpret that question to be an actual question. So how are you? Oh, you're not doing so well, you know. Really been feeling sick these days. So what we would see in that case is the wrong interpretation of the interaction. It's not a request for information. It's simply a greeting, right? So again, showing the importance of culture and having socio-linguistic competence. Then we have interaction skills, so selection of the forms, discourse organization and processes, greeting, main statement, closing line, for instance, if you're giving a speech, and of course, norms of interaction and interpretation, as I discussed just now, and the strategies for achieving goals, right? So a good way to explain norms of interaction and interpretation. When people go to the shop, what they usually do. So the shopkeeper is not at the front of the shop. What do they usually do?
Ball out, sir.
Right. So that's a typical one. To say serve, which would be the verbal element of communication in that setting. And then the non-verbal element.
Miss, can I say something, Miss?
Yes, go ahead.
Miss, when I just arrived in Jamaica, I didn't know what to say. For example, so sometimes we'll be driving and you want something to eat, but there's a little shop on the road. So I didn't know that you're supposed to say serve, So whenever I would be driving and we stop in those type of shops, I would say hello, because I didn't know that it's serve is the word. When I learned it was serve, I stopped one of these days and that guy came up and he said, serve. So I'm saying, why is he saying serve? Why is he saying serve? And then I realized that, well, serve, is the word to, to call for attention whenever you want to get served.
Don't feel no way when I go strange shop. Sometimes I say hello, like me nice.
Right. And so you're thinking that hello is fine to say, right? But especially if you go to the wholesale downtown. Have you ever been? That's what annoyed.
Well, no, Miss, why I have never been to any wholesale in downtown.
Okay, I'm going to task Janice to take you on a little trip.
You want that would be an adventure.
Well, no, Miss. No, Miss. I have walked in parade, but I've never stopped to purchase anything.
No, man, walking different from going into the wholesale.
The next time you come Kingston, call me for real.
Right, make a little list and let Janice take you down there, because you need to have that aspect of your communicative competence as well, right? So within the Peace Corps, when the volunteers come to Jamaica, we usually take them to different domains or different contexts where we would expect them to interact a lot. One would, of course, be the shop, the restaurant, and the wholesale. And so you have usually language facilitators, that's what we call them. They would take them into these areas and actually teach them. So they would demonstrate how to interact appropriately within these settings. And sometimes the first instruction is no English. So in the wholesale, no English. That's the first instruction. All right. But these are some of the norms of interaction and interpretation. So when the shopkeeper hears serve, they know that they need to come out. Someone needs service. When they hear hello, they say, okay, well, this person is not from here. And maybe they think, maybe I can overcharge them, because obviously they're not from here. They're not familiar with this service encounter context, right? So language use and the knowledge of the appropriateness of language use, that's very important to function effectively in certain domains. All right, so just move on. And of course, the cultural knowledge, having knowledge of the social structure, as well as the values and the attitudes. So for instance, in the bus, pregnant women and the elderly, usually old women, you have to get up and give them a seat, right? And the language will indicate that. I don't know what's happening now in public transportation, but when I used to take public transportation, you had to, get up and give them the seat, and you hear the conductor, suggest that somebody need to get up. No, right? Get a baby mother a seat, etc., etc. Right? So you have to know the values and the attitudes and the social structures. Maybe no, the teens, they just sit down and they don't care. Not sure what's happening now in terms of that, right? But all of this would be indicated in how we're using language with each other. So even social structure, the use of the auntie and the uncle and elder and Jenna, etc., right? These indicate social structure as well, that they are showing respect. All right. So even think about our prime minister when he just assumed the name Bro God, right? And what Bro God means. So if you're not familiar with the song, you wouldn't know that it's saying that this is a loyal friend, a great friend, etc. Right? And he assumed that name, and of course everybody say, yeah man, big up Bro God. No, people aren't really calling him that. Right? They're calling him dictator, They're calling him bro hog, etc., etc., which again speaks to the values and attitudes and the social structure. So the respect and the honor, that's gone. And we can pick up these things through language. Miss, you can give one more of those on the street assignment. Tabitha, you want to explain what you're saying there?
Never mind, Miss. I don't want anybody to take me on tonight.
Oh, I'm sure they won't.
You're not seeing my private messages?
You sent me a private message?
No, I'm getting some.
Oh.
I was talking about like the language, the negotiation class when you did the research, but that's fine.
Oh, okay, right. Yes. So that's another genre in terms of negotiating in Jamaica, negotiating in the market. First of all, you can't use English, right? So depending on where you're negotiating, you will choose the appropriate language. So if you're negotiating in a store, and depending on where the store is located, you will choose to use English or Jamaican or to code switch, right? And you have to know, for instance, on the street side, you know, they're selling the slippers and the shoes and, you know, all the other clothing items. And they tell you that the price is 5,000. You should know that the price is not 5,000. So they usually use what we call a highball technique. So they tell you a very high price. If you take it for the 5,000, then win. If you begin to bargain or ball it down, as we say, then fine, because they know that it's really worth $3,000. So even if they sell it at 3,000, they're gonna make a profit, right? So it's up to you, the customer, to initiate the negotiation by saying, you know, so I'm gonna have 5,000, a 4 I have, you know, you can't give me for 4. And then the negotiation would begin. So that is something to Janice that you would need to demonstrate when a North comes to Kingston, right? Negotiating in the various contexts. And so in the course, the language of negotiation that I told you guys about on Sunday, that you're welcome to join, the students have to collect data in different contexts. Not so much now because of COVID, but they used to go into the stores on the street side and negotiate, do actual negotiations with the vendors and to compare the data. So negotiating in a store versus negotiating on the street side, looking at the language differences and the differences in terms of discourse features, right? And you see where the cultural knowledge is very important if you're going to be successful within that area. And of course, I've had students who, you know, years after, they say, oh, Miss Walters, you know that I'm using up my negotiation knowledge and I'm negotiating every single thing that I buy, right? So that is actually a life skill, but you develop that skill from your cultural knowledge as well, right? So you guys can bear that in mind. All right, so I want us to discuss the Oliver at Large comedy. I shared the link in the group. I hope you guys got a chance to watch it and that you're ready to answer the questions. All right, so we are going to, let me see the time. All right, so we're going to take a little break, 5 minutes, and then when we come back, we are going to go through the elements of the comedy as it relates to the concepts that we've looked at so far. So sociolinguistics, any issues of the sociology of language, and then we will answer some more specific questions as it relates to communicative competence. All right, so see you back here at 8:37. Okay, so we're back. I'm just gonna go through a little bit of it because you should have watched it before.
Spend my vocation into your nice, beautiful hotel. When
All right, so we'll be talking a little bit about cultural competence, social linguistic competence, and so on. All right, so the first question, account for Oliver's associating the notion of a bellman and politics. Who wants to take that? And Nora, do you think you know the answer for that?
Yes, I think perhaps Oliver is thinking about the Jamaican Labour Party, the symbol for the JLP. So
wonderful.
So that's why he said bellman, and then the GLP is associated with a bell. That's
wonderful.
That's what
so
I'm saying. Yes,
he was associating the bellman with politics, the seminar in and politics, etc., right? And that would come from a lack of communicative competence within that context. So obviously, this is the first time he's going to a hotel, right? So he would not have knowledge of the customs and the practices or the norms of interaction. And so we saw that he did not interpret the actions appropriately. All right. So it says, note the language and mannerisms of the manager. How are they different from Oliver's language? So who wants to take that? So remember that scene where the manager came on, and he came on the scene and he said, what seems to be the problem? And then he reassured him, he stated his name, Olivius Adams, and he basically pacified the situation. So what did you note about language use in that scene? Who is taking that one? Or you guys prefer when I call your names? All right, let me look at the list. Okay, so I'm gonna ask Warika to answer that question.
I'm not able to answer because I wasn't near the computer just a while.
Oh, you didn't watch the video before? So it's the same video that I shared in the WhatsApp group.
No, miss, I didn't get to watch it. Which one of the questions? Which one of the questions? What?
All right, somebody who watched it, can you try to explain number 2? It's really
All
just...
right, miss, I could try. Vanessa.
Okay, go ahead, Vanessa.
They said note the language and mannerisms of the manager. How they are different. How are they different from Oliver's language? All right, so the manager was compared, so in contrast to Oliver, his behavior, so mannerisms would probably also be his nonverbal cues and so on, I'm thinking. So that along with his language was more controlled and confident. He was more controlled with what he was saying. His responses were controlled. And because of that, he was confident, even though compared to Oliver, Oliver was more irate, you know? So he was a little bit, Oliver was more, how should I say it? Because he wasn't disrespectful in a mess. So he was more, that descriptive word is on the tip of my tongue. He was more, somebody want to help me? Oliver was more, was it defensive? Could I say defensive?
Yes,
is that too strong?
and more emotionally involved.
Yes, more emotionally involved and more defensive. So yes, he was defensive, especially because he didn't totally understand what was happening. You know, even though the other persons were trying to be inviting, nonverbal cues and even their use of language, they were trying to accommodate him, but he was in defense, you know, and more irate, as they said. So I would say the manager was more confident and controlled, while Oliver's language was more on the defensive side. Yes, miss, something.
Right, so that's in terms of the mannerisms.
Yes, miss.
Yes, and in terms of
the language now, so the manager used standard English, right? While Oliver used the Creole, more of the Creole. The Creole totally. I didn't even remember him saying anything in standard English.
Right.
Yeah, more of the Creole, yes. So the manager used standard English and he was slower in his pace, while Oliver used the Creole and was a little bit more hasty in his speech.
Wonderful. And so we would say that that is a reflection of how language is used within the society and the different speakers. All right, particularly within the 70s, 80s. All right, so the manager would be using English and the customer in this sense, or the guest, you know, would be using Jamaican Creole. Now, if you note the social context, so remember we said that we use social factors to interpret language use. And if you listened closely, he said that he actually won the trip. So it was some raffle or something, and he won the trip. So he did not actually pay. So that would speak to certain social factors and the explanation for why he's not so familiar with the context.
Yes, miss, because if it was on a different stage, you know, when I say stage, I mean platform, probably Oliver would never pay to experience something like that. So the fact that he won it, as you said, from the church raffle, I think, it was his first experience. We could interpret that this was probably possibly his first experience in this environment or in this setting, the hotel setting for the vacation.
Right, right. All right, number 3, it says throughout the excerpt, Oliver mispronounces or misuses several words. It says make note, that should be note of at least 2 such words. Did you guys recognize any such words?
I think one was vocation, which should have been vacation.
Yes, that's correct, Marlon.
Yes, I'm not sure if I heard another.
He mispronounced
all of them.
and said buckler.
Yes.
Yes.
Buckler and hall.
Yes.
Instead
And
of saying
skying.
hall. I said hall of them.
Skying. Oh boy, that was funny.
Yes. So again, you're realizing that he's not exhibiting linguistic competence also in English, right? So remember, we just spoke about linguistic competence being the knowledge of the structure of language, right? Which includes the phonology and the morphology of, the words and so on. And so he was not demonstrating linguistic competence in English. All right, number 4. How do you propose to account for your incidentals, sir? What about Oliver's response makes this funny?
The
So
fact that
remember
he
what he
did
said?
not. Go ahead, miss.
No, go ahead, Vanessa.
I would probably say the fact that the word incidental, so first and foremost, he did not understand what the word meant. So he definitely, in his interpretation of the word, threw him off totally. So he gave a response that was not expected, or the receptionist was not anticipating a response to that. So the fact that, so how do you propose to account for the incident? So what about Albert's response? So the miscommunication, the fact that he didn't interpret, the misinterpretation of the word, that would probably be the first thing that would trigger the humor out of his response, first of all. Somebody could probably add to that.
Right. So the misinterpretation of the word incidental, and I guess the behavior that accompanied that, because remember it was saying, call the police, right? So it was very dramatic. Again, lacking in communicative competence, right? So there would be no need for him to behave like that, right? So having a knowledge of the appropriateness of language use, right? So that would be answering number 5 somewhat. State an instance in which the norms of interaction and interpretation have been violated. So can we identify any other?
Will the incident with the bellman be another one, maybe?
Yes, wonderful.
Okay.
So he thought that the man was going to steal his luggage, not knowing that he was there to assist him. All right, so again, norms of interpretation were violated. Hence, he did not know how to correctly interact within that setting.
Yes, miss. Miss, you know that these questions, you know what they remind me of? They remind me of communication studies at the 6th form level.
Okay.
Okay. These remind us something like these are questions you could possibly use to after giving a passage or so when talking about the language. These are possible questions or prompts you could use to get the children to start speaking about the language. Yes,
yes, that's correct. All right, so we are going to look quickly at the restaurant scene and then we answer these questions. So you can look at the questions, bear them in mind. In the restaurant scene, why do you think Oliver decided to start twanging? Then halfway through his complaint, Oliver stops twanging and goes back to his vernacular Jamaican Creole. Why do you think that he did this? And apart from his color, Why do you think Oliver laughed when the manager said he is also a resident of Jamaica? Let me just look at part 3. Right. Oliver is called a Butu by the waiters. Based on your knowledge as a member of the speech community, what does this mean? And based on his language use, where in Jamaica do you think he is from? In terms of his social class, background, educational level, etc. So let me go back to the clip. All right, so who wants to take number 6? What was the motivation for putting on that pseudo-American accent?
He believed he would have gotten through faster.
Right, and why?
Or probably believe he would have gotten preferential treatment, special treatment.
Right, so that's signaling that he thought that something was wrong with how they spoke naturally, right?
Yes.
He
And
wanted to fit in too, miss.
He wanted to fit in, yes. And thinking that something is wrong with his language, you know, that would be based on his socio-linguistic competence, that cultural knowledge that says, well, Jamaican Creole is for the back door, not in the front, so to speak. All right, and we call that term linguistic insecurity. And linguistic insecurity is really when a native speaker is of the perception that their language is not good enough for all contexts. All right, number 7. Why is it that he code switched or switched to sounding like a Jamaican?
Maybe he thought that that was a better way to get across his message, or he probably thought that the hotel manager would have been intimidated by that kind of rough speech.
Right, so again, getting emotional. He thought that that was the best way to express himself, right? And usually when we get angry, we go back to the vernacular. That's a natural process. And all language users actually do that. Because the vernacular language is usually referred to as the heart language. And so something like this that, you know, would have caused him to get so emotional. The best way to express it is by using the heart language. And in this case, that would be Jamaican Creole. All right, and it says, okay, right. So it says, apart from his color, why do you think Oliver laughed when the manager said he is also a resident of Jamaica?
he spoke in perfect English, so he was taken aback when he said he's a Jamaican resident as well.
Okay, Karen, I wonder what you classify as perfect English.
Well, formal language, the formal language, I suppose.
Right, I understand what you meant. Right, so you know, he was very formal. And if you listen keenly, there is what we call a received pronunciation. And this received pronunciation used to be the target of our journalists here in Jamaica. So the received pronunciation, or what we call RP, is the same BBC English that is used, and it is seen as the target pronunciation. And so he was using that R pronunciation. And, you know, Oliver said, well, you could never be a resident. You don't sound like a resident, right? So again, using his socio-linguistic competence and based on his knowledge of the speech community, you know, perhaps he has never seen anybody looking like that before, saying that they are a Jamaican, right? So the language and the race come into play here. All right, I don't think we watch this part, but I mean, we know what it means. So it says Oliver is called a buto by the waiters based on your knowledge as a member of the speech community. What does this mean? And really, Oliver's behavior would be considered that of buto behavior, in the sense that an individual within a new context lacking the knowledge on how to behave appropriately, whether that is verbal or non-verbal behavior. All right, everybody familiar with the term, right?
Butu?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, miss.
Okay, right. And so, you know, we see how we use the speech of an individual to categorize them as well, and to put them into these various groups, such as Abuto, based on language use. So number 10 says, where in Jamaica do you think he's from? And what social class, etc. And that is Oliver, the question is referring to. So where do you think he's from? Kingston, Clarendon?
Yeah, Clarendon sound like it.
So why you have to just agree with Clarendon, so Janice?
Me offended.
What Clarendon do?
No,
me
you know,
offended, Janice.
I am sorry, Miss. Me don't really know the parish them like that and how people behave, but most time people always say the country at Clarendon.
Oh gosh, no.
I'm so offended.
We're very near to Kingston, you know.
What type of foolishness?
Country is Clarendon, really?
Country, Clarendon.
So
If it's not Clarendon, then it's St. Elizabeth.
Exactly.
But the two of them close.
Oh my guys.
It seems like we have to take you on a country tour, Janice. All right, so, you know, we would agree that he's probably from a rural area. What about social class?
Working class, rank and file.
Right, so again, he won the trip, right? So we would use that social information to kind of inform us about his social class, also his language use. So we use the social information to explain the language use. So obviously he has never been in that kind of domain before. He's not able to express a level of understanding of some of the basic terms. So clearly, you know, he can't afford it. This is his first time. right? So we would say he's probably of the lower to middle class, working class. All right. And this is an example of what we call linguistic profiling. And we do it every single day, where we profile speakers based on their language use. And sometimes we use linguistic stereotypes. And we learn a little bit more about these stereotypes when we look at language variation. All right, so today we were able to cover communicative competence and linguistic competence, with linguistic competence being the knowledge of the structure of language and the communicative competence being the knowledge of the appropriateness of language use. Any questions before I go to discuss the first assignment?
No, miss.
No, miss, it's clear.
No, miss.
No, miss. Great discussion tonight.
All right, great. So let me just bring up the assignment.
Miss, what do you think about, so in the workplace, right? So I'm a teacher. What do you think about, you know, if the principal or the vice principal, or let's say a senior teacher who could probably be your supervisor, refers to you, probably like a younger teacher, by his or her first name or by an alias? Would it be acceptable if that same teacher, the younger teacher, referred to the supervisor or the VP by his or her first name or by an alias?
No.
So if my principal is to say Vanessa, or that same school I'm teaching, I went to this school, so I didn't really have a nickname, but another teacher would have a nickname, Princess. And you would refer to, if we're having a meeting, you say Princess so-and-so or Vanessa so-and-so. Would I be wrong if I referred to my principal by her first name?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Why you say yes?
Yeah, why yes? I want to know
It
because
depends on the culture of the place, and if that's not the culture, like our American companies, everybody calls them one by them first name. If that's not the culture, it's gonna be wrong. And in Jamaican context, that's not our culture.
Precisely.
no, but we are all, so it's okay for my principal to say Vanessa or to call me by
Yes,
my
because she's the
nickname.
leader. It also have to do with power and just how we grew up. It's I don't think there's nothing much to it other than the culture what we have, you know. I get
What
what you're coming
culture
with, you
though?
know, and it's unfair, but I just the
But is
culture.
it something that we need to break out of? Is it
Yes,
okay if I
but
say
the older people them now break out it. You might start it
Yes.
with your people, with you. So when you reach her level, you can always break it. But
Yes,
she,
it's senior
them
and
now
junior
go,
thing.
yeah, them frightened for power and them get them little power, them now let go fight, ma'am.
But that's the thing now. I don't want it to be like out of fright or anything. You know, you really want it to be something that is just out of respect. So, Miss, what do you think if I say my principal's name is Shanice and I say, okay, Shanice, I think that was a good plan, so and so and so, just as if she could say, Vanessa, what do you think, Miss?
All right, so some very interesting responses. And this question is rooted in socio-linguistic competence, so it's relevant for the course, as well as sociolinguistic universals. And one of the sociolinguistic universals as it relates to politeness is that the superior can use more informal terms with a subordinate, but not the other way around. That is a sociolinguistic universal as it relates to politeness. So the subordinate is expected to use the proper title, but the superior can just call you by your first name. That is a sociolinguistic universal, meaning that is observed across the world. So you can talk down to your subordinate, but the subordinate cannot do the same. And of course, as Janice said, right, it goes back to power, language and power. So if you do it, it might be seen as disrespectful, but then we can include culture. And someone mentioned the culture of the organization. Now, if it's an organization where you are calling each other on a first name basis, fine. And obviously, based on what you have described, that's not the case. Okay? So if it is that you have an issue with it, it's not to call the principal by her first name to say Mary, but it's to speak with the principal to say, you know, I've noticed that several times in meetings you've mentioned or you've referred to me by my first name.
Or
and
an
I'd
alias.
just like to know if we're going in that direction as an organization or if we're going to maintain the use of titles. No,
So
it could be out of
rude,
habit, you know. What's that?
Continue, miss. When you're finished, I'll ask.
Okay, right. Because they say you went to the school, right?
Yes, miss. But I'm not the one who is getting the nickname, you know. It's the other colleague. But when she said it, it was like, you know, like, that one kind of like, wow.
And sometimes it's habit. So within the Department of Language, Linguistics, and Philosophy, I shared with you guys on Sunday that I was a student in the department, right? So as an undergraduate student, then a graduate student. So the administrators there, they're used to me as Kadian, right? So getting a PhD, I'm not expecting them to say Dr. Walters, Dr. Walters. Unless it is so very, very formal because of habit. But I still refer to the administrators by their titles. So for instance, I would say Mrs. White. But she's not saying Dr. Walters, she's saying Kadian. But it's just based on how we interact. So it all depends on the culture. Now, if we're in a formal meeting, let's say with the dean, she's not gonna refer to me as Kadian. She's gonna say Dr. Walters, right? So again, it's based on culture and expectations. So if it is that your colleague has a problem with that, I don't think that what she should do is to try to mirror what the principal did, but to actually meet with the principal privately to say that she feels uncomfortable being referred to as princess in a formal meeting.
And would she be wrong to ask the principal to probably refer to her as, say for instance, Miss Brown? Would she be wrong to ask that of the principal or any other supervisor at all? Because, you know, guys, we all could use this bit of advice. So would any of us be wrong if we ask for a supervisor to refer to us by, say, Mr. Brown or Miss Brown? Would we be wrong if we ask that? Not saying they're going to do it, but if I approached a supervisor,
right? But it's very tricky because you want to think about your approach. So if it is that the young lady is gonna meet with the principal, you know, she would comment on the nickname to say princess, and you know, comment that, well, you know, Miss Brown, I don't really want this to be a habit because I don't want other people to refer to me by that same term within the organization. So I'm just asking that when we're having these meetings, you refer to me by Miss White. So that's perfectly fine. But you have to be very careful in your approach because you don't want to be accused of insubordination. When they think that, oh, you get bright and feisty, how dare you? So you have to be careful in the approach. I think that the way to go is to comment on the fact that she doesn't want that nickname to get out and other individuals within the organization begin to call her that. Right. So she's trying to prevent that from happening. And I think that would be reasonable. I think that would be a reasonable.
And especially when you're working with children, you know, we'll be on the campus and the minute you hear another teacher say princess or fatty, you know, or browning, the kids are no longer the same auntie uncle vibe, miss. They will no longer call you Miss Brown. They're going to say, I got princess class now. I got fatty class now. So thank you, miss, for that advice. Thank you so much. It's something that always came up, and it is first I'm getting this refreshing response and approach, and thank you for that.
You can't say that thing couldn't have nicknames though. The students and give the nicknames.
No man, we know
I
say they give
was
it.
Right, I was about to say that.
Yeah man, we know we have a nickname, you know, but you see when they get the real one where we refer to each other, then feel like them win. But definitely,
so
man,
that one day you know want them get. Okay.
You know, man, a little more intimate one, but you them man, then give with them nickname, man, Janice. Right true.
But Vanessa, while I agree with Miss to ask her, the principal, that is not to call you by the nickname. But I'm wondering though, Miss, would it be taking it a step too far to suggest that she says Miss Brown or Miss DaCosta or...
It's tricky, don't it? Because
I don't,
the minute you ask for something, you know, them think you're part in a place.
All right. So again, the approach includes your tone, right? So you don't want to sound too demanding. But at the same time, if it is the practice within the organization to refer to individuals as Miss Brown, Mr. Brown, then that's a reasonable request. If it is that they're referring to individuals by the first name, then you can ask that they refer to you by your first name instead of your nickname. But if it is the practice of the organization to use the last name, Miss Brown, Mr. Brown, then that's perfectly fine. That request would be reasonable because you're not asking them to do something that is not normally done.
One taken.
Okay, there. All right, so let us just go into a discussion of the assignment. I mean, we will be discussing it as you embark upon completing the paper, right? But I just want to go through with you guys. Let me see if I can increase this a bit. All right, so it's due the 20th of February, and it says, according to Max Weinreich, a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. Using any territory with which you are familiar, outside of Jamaica, of course, discuss the well-established view in the sociology of language that the status of a particular variety in a given society may be more the result of extra-linguistic factors than linguistic ones. And when we talk about status, or the young people saying status nowadays, we're talking about the prestigious form, the stigmatized form, whether it is an official language or a national language. So what makes a language an official language? Is it about the linguistic properties of the language? Or are we looking more at extra linguistic factors such as social factors, cultural factors, political, and other factors, right? So usually, for instance, let us take Jamaica. Since no one is going to do Jamaica, we can use that for our discussion. Jamaican Creole is seen as a national language, not an official language. Is it something about the language itself, why it's not an official language when most Jamaicans speak it? Or is it about social factors such as language attitudes, linguistic discrimination, language shaming, cultural factors based on our history, and political factors? So your discussion would include the status of the language, whether it is prestigious or stigmatized, whether it's an official or a national language, and what are the factors that would lead to that particular status. So are these extra linguistic factors or linguistic ones? When we talk about linguistic factors, we're talking about the syntax and the phonology, the morphology, the semantics, the lexical items, and so on. All right? So a language is a dialect with an army and a navy is basically saying that a language is a code that has political backing, cultural backing, social backing, right? So it has an army and a navy. It has support, whether in attitudes or in resources, such as even financial resources to develop the language. So we can look at Papiamento in Curacao, and this is their Creole language, and it's the first language there. And so Papiamento is now an official language in Curacao, and it's a Creole language. So it being a Creole language and being named an official language shows that there are extra linguistic factors in determining the status of a language and not so much linguistic factors, because it's a Creole language, just like Jamaican Creole. So they are similar in many ways in terms of structure, how they were developed, and so on. And it would be considered a new language, fairly new language, right? So Jamaican Creole and Papiamento, they have, you know, similar structures and so on, being that they are Creole languages. So it cannot be the linguistic factors that determine the status of a language. It cannot be the syntax and the phonology and the morphology. It has to be the extra linguistic factors, such as language attitudes, such as the political motivation to declare the language an official language. And there was strong political motivation in Curacao to declare Papiamento as an official language. We don't have that in Jamaica, right? So your essay would be to demonstrate how these extra linguistic factors influence the status of a particular language based on, you know, where you choose. So it doesn't have to be a regional language. It doesn't have to be in the Caribbean. All right, so Enord, if you want to look at the language situation in Tanzania and you want to look at language status there, then you can choose one of those varieties. Right? So
yes, miss, I
anything
want to.
outside.
I will look there.
What's that?
Yes, miss, I think I will look at Tanzania.
Okay, great. Right. So any situation outside of Jamaica would be fine. All right. And you would submit a typed version. Well, not really. The soft copy only, you would send it to kadianwaltersue@gmail.com. Ensure you have your cover page, number your pages, and so on. And it should be no longer than 1,000 words. You're also expected to use references, academic, credible references, and you should do your in-text citation, and you should have your reference list. All right, and I will provide some resources. Now there is a Google group for the course. We are planning to transfer all the readings to the Google Classroom. All right, so that will take some time because I've had that group for quite a while and it has all the readings that you need. So once we are able to transfer the material, you will have that in the Google Classroom. All right, any questions? I know that you would need some time to read through for yourselves. So you can always read through the instructions, send me an email with your questions, or you can WhatsApp me.
And this coursework, Miss, will be placed in the Google Classroom?
Yes, and I will also put it in the WhatsApp group.
Okay. Miss, are you able to send me an invite for the Google Classroom?
I am not sure if I'm able to do it, because I'm not the one who invited the others. I can check though.
Yes, we did it last night for the for morphology, because I think the email address that they're using, I have a classroom attached to that email already, so I'm not getting the UE invite. So I created another email address to facilitate the UE Google Classrooms.
Okay, so what I'd ask you to do is just to send me an email.
Yes, miss.
And then I'll just try to add you to the class.
Okay, no problem, miss. And I'll let you know if I receive and if it's successful.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions? Oh, we are 10 minutes over time.
Yes, I'm not so sure if I understand what it is that is required in the paper.
Okay, so you're going to choose a territory with which you're familiar outside of Jamaica, and you're going to be discussing this statement. A language is a dialect with an army and a navy. Usually when we talk about languages versus dialects, we believe that one is more prestigious than the other, and that a dialect is a sub-language. So it's not quite at the status of a language. And that is more so because of extra linguistic factors, such as social factors like language attitudes. So people may have a negative attitude towards a dialect and it would never be named a language. So you're gonna choose a territory or a language situation, and you're gonna choose a language demonstrating how it became prestigious or how it became stigmatized, how it became an official language or a national language based on extra linguistic factors rather than linguistic ones. So you're demonstrating that it's not so much about the structural components of the language, why it is seen as prestigious, but it's more so about how people feel about the language and its speakers. It's more about the language attitudes and the social stereotypes, the cultural attachments, and the political backing or the political support that is given to the language, why it enjoys a particular status. Whereas another language, even within that same territory, does not enjoy the privilege of being called prestigious, not because of its structural properties, but because people have a negative view of the language. So you're basically going to be talking about why a dialect within a particular region is not called a language and it's not treated as such based on extra linguistic factors. Or you can choose a language and show why it is considered to be prestigious. So it depends on the territory that you choose. So you can go with a language that is considered to be prestigious or one that is considered to be stigmatized. And then you're gonna show us based on the extra linguistic factors why it is that it enjoys that status. Because we're saying that we know that it has nothing to do with the structure of the language, but more so the social prestige that is attached to it.
Okay, I see. So it's not that it should have all 4 bulleted points. It's either.
No, because for instance, the dialect that you choose, it might be a stigmatized dialect. So you're going to show us why it is stigmatized and why it is not considered to be prestigious. So it's prestige versus stigma, official language versus national language.
Okay.
Right, so there is no language that will have, let's say, prestige and stigma at the same time.
Okay.
Right, so you wouldn't have all 4. But as you go along and you read up the literature, you will understand a little bit more, and we will go through in the next session. We will have some more discussions about the statement, a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. And you can also think about what that means to you.
Okay.
All right. And guys, please, when you are writing your papers, please include the statement and explain what the statement means.
Okay.
So that statement, a language is a dialect with an army and a navy, we wanted to explain that first before going into the language situation that you choose. All right. So any other questions, you may send me an email. Thank you all for coming.
Okay, good night, everyone. Good night, Miss.
Okay.
Good night, Miss. Good night, everyone.
Good night, Karen.